Chapter 8. Hell's Highway. Holland, September 17th through October 1st, 1944. It was a beautiful end-of-summer day in northwest Europe, with a bright blue sky and no wind. The Allied airborne attack came as a surprise to the Germans. There were no Luftwaffe planes to contest the air armada. Once over Holland, there was some anti-aircraft fire, which intensified 5 minutes from the DZ, but there was no breaking of formation or evasive action by the pilots, as there had been over Normandy. Easy came down exactly where it was supposed to be. So did virtually all the companies in the division. The landing was soft, on freshly plowed fields, in the memory of the men of Easy, the softest they ever experienced. Webster wrote his parents, "It was the most perfectly flat jump field I've ever seen." Basically, Holland is just a big, glorified jump field. The official history of the 101st declared that this was the most successful landing that the division had ever had, in either training or combat. The only problem Winters could recall was the need to get off the DZ as soon as possible to avoid getting hit by falling equipment and landing gliders. It was just raining equipment, he said. Helmets, guns, bundles. Malarkey remembered running off the field to the assembly area, marked by smoke grenades. He heard a crash overhead. 2 gliders had collided and came plummeting to earth. There was no German opposition on the ground. The company assembled quickly and set off toward its objective. The objective was a bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal at Zonn. The route was over a north-south road that ran from Eindhoven to Wegel to Nijmegen to Arnhem. The road was part asphalt, part brick, wide enough for 2 automobiles to pass each other, but a tight squeeze for 2 trucks. Like most roads in Holland, it was a meter or so above the surrounding fields, meaning that anything moving on it stood out against the horizon. The road was the key to Operation Market Garden. The task for the American airborne troops was to take control of the road and its many bridges to open a path for the British 30th Corps, with the Guards Armored Division in the van, to drive through to Arnhem and thus over the lower Rhine River. Easy landed about 30 kilometers behind the front line, some 15 kilometers north of Eindhoven. The 506th initial objective was Zonn, then Eindhoven, which meant the initial march was south. The regiment moved out with 1st Battalion going through the field to the west of the road, 2nd Battalion down the road, 3rd Battalion in reserve. 2nd Battalion order of march was D Company leading, then E Company, Battalion HQ, and F Company following. The column entered Zonn. The residents were drawn up on each side of the road as for a parade. Unlike Normandy, where the French villagers mainly stayed out of sight, the Dutch were ecstatic to be liberated. The parish priest, Husson of Zonn, handed out cigars. Orange flags, forbidden by the German occupiers, flew from the windows. People gave the passing paratroopers apples and other fruit. Bartenders opened their taps and handed out glasses of beer. Officers had a hard time keeping the men moving. Emerging from Zonn, less than a kilometer from the bridge, the column was fired on by a German 88 and by a machine gun, both shooting straight down the road. There were no casualties. D Company covered the right side of the road, E Company the left. They pushed forward, firing rifles and lobbing mortar shells, which silenced the opposition. But the Germans had done their job, delaying the advance long enough to complete their preparations for blowing the bridge. When the lead American elements were 25 meters or less from the bridge, it blew in their faces. There was a hail of debris of wood and stone. Winters, with Nixon beside him, hit the ground. Big pieces of timber and large rocks rained down around him. Winters thought to himself, "What a hell of a way to die in combat." Colonel Sink ordered 2nd Battalion to lay down a covering fire, while 1st Battalion looked for a way to get over the canal. Corporal Gordon Carson of Easy spotted a couple of waterlogged rowboats on the far side and decided an immediate action. He stripped stark naked, made a perfect racing dive into the water, swam across and fetched a boat that carried some men from the 1st Squad about halfway over the canal before it sank. Other men from 1st Battalion, more practical, took the doors off a nearby barn and with the help of Sergeant Lipton and several E Company men, laid them across the bridge pilings. The German rear guard, its mission accomplished, withdrew. Engineers attached to the regiment improved the footbridge over the canal, but it was so weak that it could bear only a few men at a time. It took the battalion hours to get across. It was getting dark. Sink got word that the Guards' armored division had been held up by 88s a few kilometers south of Eindhoven, and he did not know the state of German defenses in the city. He ordered a halt for the night. The platoon leaders posted outposts. Those not on duty slept in haystacks, woodsheds, whatever they could find. Privates Hubler and Webster of Sergeant Rader's 2nd Squad 1st Platoon found a farmhouse. The Dutch farmer welcomed them. He led them through the barn, already occupied with Regimental Headquarters Company. You shoot 'em, we loot 'em was its motto, who resented their presence. On to the kitchen, where the Dutchman gave them half a dozen mason jars filled with preserved meat, peaches, and cherries. Hubler gave him some cigarettes, and Webster handed him a D-ration chocolate bar. He sucked in the smoke greedily, the first decent cigarette he had enjoyed in 5 years, but saved the candy for his little boy, who had never tasted chocolate. Webster decided on the spot that he liked the Dutch much better than the British or French. In the morning, the march resumed, with 2nd Battalion following 1st Battalion on the road south. On the edge of Eindhoven, a city of 100,000 that rose abruptly from the rich black soil, Colonel Sink spread his regiment, sending 2nd Battalion out to the left, with Easy on the far left flank. Winters gave the order over his radio. "Lieutenant Brewer, put your scouts out and take off." Brewer spread 1st Platoon out in textbook formation, scouts to the front, no bunching up, moving fast. The platoon advanced through truck gardens and freshly plowed fields toward the houses on the edge of the city. There was only one thing wrong. Brewer was in front, with his map case at his side, his binoculars hanging around his neck, obviously an officer. Worse, he was well over 6 feet tall. Gordon thought he looked like a field marshal on parade. He was a perfect target. Winters shouted over his radio, "Get back! Drop back! Drop back!" But Brewer could not hear him. He kept moving ahead. Every man in the company, every man in battalion could see what was sure to happen. A shot rang out. A sniper had fired from one of the houses. Brewer went down like a tree felled by an expert lumberman. He had been shot in the throat, just below the jawline. Gordon and a couple of other enlisted men ran over to him, even though their orders were to keep moving and leave any wounded for the medics. They looked down at Brewer, bleeding profusely from his wound. "Ah, hell, forget him," someone said. "He's gone. He's going to die." They moved on, leaving Brewer lying there. He heard it all and never forgot it, and never let the men forget it when he recovered and rejoined the company. After that, there was only light, scattered resistance, mainly from snipers. The 506th got into Eindhoven without further difficulty. The Dutch were out to welcome them. Many spoke English. "So nice to see you," they called out. "Glad you have come. We have waited so long." They brought out chairs, hot tea, fresh milk, apples, pears, peaches. Orange flags and orange armbands, hidden for years, blossomed on all the houses and shirt sleeves. The applause was nearly deafening. The men had to shout to each other to be heard. It was the most sincere Thanksgiving demonstration any of us were to see, Webster wrote, and it pleased us very much. It took most of the rest of the day to push through the crowds to secure the bridges over the Dommel River. It did not matter. The British tankers did not show up until late that afternoon. They promptly stopped, set up housekeeping, and proceeded to make tea. Winters set up outposts. Those not on duty joined the celebration. They posed for pictures, signed autographs, some signing Monty, others Eisenhower, drank a shot or two of cognac, ate marvelous meals of fresh vegetables, roast veal, applesauce, and milk. The civilians continued to mob them as if they were movie stars. Winters still shakes his head at the memory. It was just unbelievable. The company spent the night in hastily dug foxholes in Toncherre, a suburb on the east side of Eindhoven. On the morning of September 19th, Winters got orders to march east to Helmond in order to broaden the Eindhoven section of the corridor and to make contact with the enemy. A squadron of Cromwell tanks from the Hussars accompanied Easy. Some of the men rode on the backs of the Cromwells. The tanks, Webster wrote, barked, sputtered, clanked, and squeaked in their accustomed manner as we set out. Winters led a forced march to Nuenen, about 5 kilometers, encountering no opposition, but once again cheering Dutch, offering food and drink. Webster remarked that this was the village in which Vincent van Gogh had been born. "Who the hell's that?" Rader asked. Beyond Nuenen, the picnic ended. The Germans had recovered from their surprise and were beginning to mount counterattacks. "Kraut tanks! Kraut tanks!" Webster heard Private Jack Matthews call out. "Oh, Jesus Christ," Webster thought to himself as he and the others jumped off the Cromwells to dive into a ditch. Less than 400 meters away, the first in a column of German tanks slithered through the bushes like an evil beast. The 107th Panzer Brigade, stationed in Helmond, was attacking west toward Nuenen with some 50 tanks, more than we had ever seen at one time, Winters recalled. Sergeant Martin saw a German tank almost hidden in a fence row about 100 meters away. A British tank was coming up. Martin ran back to it, climbed aboard, and told the commander there was an enemy tank just below and to the right. The tank continued to move forward. Martin cautioned the commander that if he continued his forward movement, the German tank would soon see him. "I can't see him, old boy," the commander replied, "and if I can't see him, I can't very well shoot at him." "You'll see him damn soon," Martin shouted as he jumped down and moved away. The German tank fired. The shell penetrated the British tank's armor. Flame erupted. The crew came flying out of the hatch. The gunner pulled himself out last. He had lost his legs. The tank, now a flaming inferno, continued to move forward on its own, forcing Bull Randleman to move in the direction of the enemy to avoid it. A second British tank came forward. It, too, got blasted. Altogether, 4 of the British tanks were knocked out by the German 88s. The 2 remaining tanks turned around and began to move back into Nuenen. Easy Company fell back with them. Sergeant Rogers had been hit. He was bleeding badly. "They kind of pinked you a little, didn't they, Paul?" Lipton said. Rogers let out a string of profanity that lasted a full minute. Lipton remembered, most unusual for him. Lieutenant Buck Compton got hit in the buttocks. Medic Eugene Rowe went to Compton's aid. Malarkey, Private Ed Heffron, and a couple of others came forward to help. As Heffron reached to help, Compton looked up and moaned, "She always said my big ass would get in the way." He looked at the 5 men gathered around him. "Take off," Compton ordered. "Let the Germans take care of me." He was such a big man, and the fire was so intense that the troopers were tempted to do just that. But Malarkey, Guarnieri, and Joe Toya pulled a door off a farm outbuilding and laid Compton face down on it. Then they skidded him up the roadside ditch to one of the retreating British tanks and loaded him face down onto the back end. The bullet that hit Compton had gone into the right cheek of his buttocks, out, into the left cheek, and out. Lipton looked at him and couldn't help laughing. "You're the only guy I ever saw in my life that got hit with 1 bullet and got 4 holes, he told Compton. Compton growled, "If I could get off this tank, I'd kill you." Other men joined Compton on the backs of the withdrawing tanks. Stroll and Gordon, who had been out on the flank, Stroll with a mortar and Gordon with his machine gun, had to run across an open field to rejoin the outfit. The weight of their weapons slowed them down. Bullets were kicking up the dirt at their feet. There was a 3-foot-high wooden fence between them and the road. "We hurdled it like 2 horses, Stroll said. Safely on the other side, they paused to catch their breath. "That's one thing you and I will never do again," Stroll said. "I don't think we did it the first time," Gordon replied. They took off again for the tanks, caught up, and Gordon pulled himself onto the back of one, but Stroll was dead beat. He put his hand up. Gordon grabbed it as Stroll passed out. Gordon hauled him aboard and got him secured. Randleman, who had been in the van, got hit in the shoulder and cut off from his squad. He ducked into a barn. A German soldier came running in behind him. Randleman bayoneted the man, killed him, and covered his body with hay. Then he covered himself up with hay and hid out. Once in town, men found shelter in buildings that they used as cover to move around and set up some semblance of a return fire. Easy managed to hold up the Germans, but was unable to force them back. Sergeant Chuck Grant got hit, among many others. Private Robert Van Klinken was killed by a machine gun burst when he tried to run forward with a bazooka. Private James Miller, a 19-year-old replacement, was killed when a hand grenade went off on his kidneys. Private Ray Cobb had the shakes. Webster heard Sergeant Martin comforting him, the way a mother talks to a dream-frightened child. "That's all right, Cobb, don't worry. We're not going back out there. Just relax, Cobb. Take it easy." Martin went over to a Cromwell, hiding behind a building. He pointed out the church steeple and asked the commander to take it out, as the Germans were using it as an observation post. "So sorry, old man, we can't do it," the commander replied. "We have orders not to destroy too much property. Friendly country, you know." The Germans kept pressing. Their aim was to get through to the highway leading from Eindhoven to Nijmegen, Hell's Highway, as the 101st named it, and cut it. But they could not get through Nuenen. Winters had decided to withdraw under the cover of darkness, but before giving ground he wanted a prisoner for interrogation. He called for volunteers for a patrol. No one volunteered. "Sergeant Toya," he called out. "Yes, sir, I'm here. I need 2 volunteers." Toya selected Corporal James Campbell and a private and set out. They were tripping over British and American bodies as they made their way to a nearby wood. A German soldier fired at them. Toya told his men to stay put. He crept into the woods, went around the German, got behind him, and gently placed his bayonet against the man's back. The soldier gave Toya no trouble. Pushing the German ahead of him, Toya returned through the woods and delivered his prisoner. The company retreated to Tonchara. Winters noticed that the Dutch people who had been cheering them in the morning were closing their shutters, taking down the orange flags, looking sad and depressed, expecting the Germans to reoccupy Eindhoven. "We, too, were feeling badly," Winters remarked. "We were limping back to town." After getting his men settled down and fed, Winters went to Battalion HQ. He found Lieutenant Colonel Strayer and his staff laughing it up, eating a hearty supper in a jovial mood. Strayer saw Winters, turned, and with a big smile asked, "How did it go today, Winters?" Tight-lipped, Winters replied, "I had 15 casualties today and took a hell of a licking." The conversation in the room came to an abrupt stop. Easy got 1 break that day. The company bedded down in Tonchara, so it watched, rather than endured, a 70-plane Luftwaffe bombing mission against the British supply column in Eindhoven. As the Allies had no anti-aircraft guns in the city, the Germans were able to drop bright yellow marker flares and then make run after run, dropping their bombs. The city was severely damaged. Over 800 inhabitants were wounded, 227 killed. The next morning, Strayer moved his other 2 companies into Nuenen. They found Sergeant Randleman holding the fort. The German tanks had moved out to the northwest toward Zon. Company E set up close-in defenses around Eindhoven and stayed there 2 days. On the morning of September 22nd, Winters got orders to mount his men on trucks. The 506th was moving to Uden on Hell's Highway to defend the town against a panzer attack that the Dutch underground warned was coming from Helmond. Regimental HQ Company, with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Chase, the 506th Regimental XO in command, accompanied Easy and 3 British tanks in an advance party. There were only enough trucks for the 100 or so men of HQ Company, plus a platoon of Easy. Winters, Lieutenant Welsh, and Captain Nixon joined the convoy. The trucks got through Fechel and into Uden without encountering resistance. Winters and Nixon climbed to the top of the church steeple to have a look. When they got to the belfry, the first thing they saw was German tanks cutting the highway between Fechel and Uden. Then Winters spotted a patrol coming toward Uden. He ran down the stairs, gathered the platoon, and said, "Men, there's nothing to get excited about. The situation is normal. We are surrounded." He organized an attack, moved out to meet the German patrol, and hit it hard, driving it back. Colonel Chase told Winters to set up a defense. Easy, with help from HQ Company, set up roadblocks on all roads leading into Uden. Winters told Sergeant Lipton to take every man he could find, regardless of unit, and put him into the line. Lipton saw 2 British soldiers walking by. He grabbed one by the shoulder and ordered, "You two come with me." The man looked Lipton up and down calmly and said, "Sergeant, is that the way you address officers in the American Army?" Lipton took a closer look and saw that on his British combat uniform was the insignia of a major. "No, sir," he stammered. "I'm sorry." The major gave him a bit of a half-smile as he walked away. The Germans did not come on. Had they realized that there were fewer than 130 men in Nuenen and only 3 tanks, they surely would have overrun the town. But evidently Winter's quick counterattack against their lead patrol convinced them that Nuenen was held in strength. Whatever the reason, they shifted the focus of their attack from Nuenen to Veghel. Winters and Nixon climbed to the belfry again. They had a clear view to Veghel, 6 kilometers south. It was fascinating, Winters recalled, sitting behind the German lines, watching tanks approach Veghel, German Air Force strafing, a terrific exchange of firepower. The members of EASY who were in Veghel remembered it as pure hell, the most intense shelling they had ever experienced. It was a desperate battle, the biggest the 506th had yet experienced. It was also critical. The enemy's cutting the road did not mean simply his walking across a piece of asphalt, the history of the division points out. That road was loaded with British transport vehicles of every type. Cutting the road meant fire and destruction for the vehicles that were caught. It meant clogging the road for its entire length, with vehicles that suddenly had nowhere to go. For the men at Nijmegen and Arnhem, cutting the road was like severing an artery. The stuff of life, food, ammunition, medical supplies, no longer came north. Webster was in Veghel. When the German artillery began to come in, he took shelter in a cellar with a half-dozen EASY men, plus some Dutch civilians. It was a very depressing atmosphere, he wrote, listening to the civilians moan, shriek, sing hymns, and say their prayers. Private Don Hubler was with the 3rd Squad, 1st Platoon, hiding in a gateway. He decided to have some fun with Private Ferris Rice, so he whistled a perfect imitation of an incoming shell. Rice fell flat on his face. That put Hubler in stitches. "Ha ha ha ha! Boy, sure sucked you in on that one. God damn you, Hubler! That's bad on a guy." Bzoo! Bam! A real shell came in. Hubler stopped laughing. Colonel Sink came roaring up in a jeep, jumped out, and began barking orders right and left. He got the men of EASY and those of D and F companies to establish a perimeter defense with orders to shoot at anything moving. Webster and the others climbed out of the cellar and went into an orchard. Webster and Private Don Wiseman frantically dug a foxhole, 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, 4 feet deep. They wanted to go deeper, but water was already seeping in. Sitting helplessly under intense artillery fire is pure hell, combat at its absolute worst. The shells were coming in by 3s. Wiseman and I sat in our corners and cursed. Every time we heard a shell come over, we closed our eyes and put our heads between our legs. Every time the shells went off, we looked up and grinned at each other. I felt sick inside. I said I'd give a foot to get out of that place. We smelled the gunpowder as a rancid thunderhead enveloped our hole. A nasty, inch-square chunk of hot steel landed on Wiseman's lap. He smiled. 3 more, and then 3, and then 3. No wonder men got combat exhaustion. Webster later wrote his parents, "Artillery takes the joy out of life." Things quieted down sufficiently for the supply people to bring up some British rations. Webster shouted at Hubler to throw him a can. Hubler was sitting above ground, laughing and joking, having a picnic with 4 or 5 others. "Come and get it," he called back. "The 88s are taking a break." An 88 came in. Hubler leaped into his hole with his buddies piling in on top of him. The men spent the night in their foxholes. There was a drizzle. The air was frosty. They sat with their heads on their knees, pulled their raincoats around their shoulders, and nodded off the best they could. Back in Nuenen, Winters and Nixon lost their front-row seat. A German sniper spotted them and fired away. He hit the bell in the belfry. The ringing noise and the surprise sent the 2 officers flying down the steps. "I don't think our feet touched the steps more than 2 or 3 times, Winters declared. He set up his CP at a store on the road junction on the south end of town. The owners, the Van Oor family who lived there, welcomed them, then went down to the cellar. Winters had his men move the furniture and rugs to one side, then brought in the machine guns, ammunition, Molotov cocktails, and explosives, and prepared to defend against any attack. His plan was, if the Germans came on with tanks, to drop composition C charges and Molotov cocktails on the tanks from the second-floor windows, the Russian style of tank defense. With that position set, Winters went to the other end of town, the northwest corner. On the left side of the road coming into town, there was a manor house with a tavern on the other side. Winters told Welsh to put the roadblock between the two buildings, backed up by one of the British tanks. He indicated he wanted Welsh to set up his CP in the manor. Winters checked his other roadblocks, then at 2200 he returned to the northwest corner for one last look around. The British tank was where it was supposed to be, but there was no one in it or around it. Nor were there any E Company men at the roadblock. Highly agitated, Winters ran over to the manor and knocked on the door. A maid answered. She spoke no English, he spoke no Dutch, but somehow she figured out that he wanted to see the soldiers. She escorted him down a hallway and opened the door to a large, lavishly furnished living room. The sight that greeted my eyes left me speechless, Winters recalled. Sitting on the floor, in front of a large, blazing fire in a fireplace, was a beautiful Dutch girl, sharing a dinner of ham and eggs with a British lieutenant. She smiled at Winters. The lieutenant turned his head and asked, "Is my tank still outside?" Winters exploded. The lieutenant got moving. Winters went back to the street to look for Welsh and his men. Where the hell can Harry be? He looked at the tavern across the street and his question answered itself. He went in and found Welsh and his men sacked out on the top of the bar. Harry and I talked this whole situation over, was the polite way Winters put it. Satisfied that we would have a roadblock set up to my satisfaction, and that I could get a good night's sleep and not worry about a breakthrough, I left. In Veghel, the Germans continued to attack through the night and into the next morning. British planes and tanks finally drove them off. The 506th moved out again, getting to Nuenen on the afternoon of September 24th. The Easy Company men who had been trapped in Veghel assumed that the small force isolated in Nuenen had been annihilated. Those in Nuenen likewise assumed that the rest of the company in Veghel had been annihilated. When the two parts reunited and learned that the entire company had survived the encounter in good shape, there was mutual elation. The company prepared to spend the night in Nuenen. The men who had been there were amazed when the men who had undergone the shelling in Veghel dug foxholes 4 feet deep. They had only dug 6 inches or so into the ground and let it go at that. The officers had billets in houses in Nuenen. Lieutenant Peacock of 1st Platoon approached Webster's foxhole and told him to come along. Webster climbed out, and they walked to Peacock's billet above a liquor store on the village square. "Take that broom and sweep this room out," Peacock ordered. "Yes, sir," Webster replied, thinking to himself, what kind of man is this? He decided, I would rather starve to death as a bum in civilian life than be a private in the army. The Germans had lost Nuenen and Veghel, but they hardly had given up. On the evening of September 24th, they attacked Hell's Highway from the west, south of Veghel, and managed to drive a salient across it. Once again, the road was cut. It had to be reopened. Although the strategic objective of Market Garden had been lost by now, on September 20th, the Germans had retaken the bridge at Arnhem from Colonel John Frost's battalion of the British 1st Army Airborne, and the division as a whole had been thrown on the defensive, and the Guards' Armored Division had been halted on September 22nd, some 5 kilometers south of Arnhem. It was still critical to keep the road open. Tens of thousands of Allied troops were dependent on it totally for their supplies. The units north of Veghel included the U.S. 101st at Nuenen and the 82nd at Nijmegen, the British 1st Airborne north of the Lower Rhine outside Arnhem, the Guards Armored and the 43rd Wessex Divisions, the Polish Parachute Regiment, and the British 4th Dorset and 2nd Household Cavalry Regiments, all between Nijmegen and Arnhem. If the 101st could not regain control of the road and keep it open, what was already a major defeat would turn into an unmitigated disaster of catastrophic proportions. General Taylor ordered Colonel Sink to eliminate the German salient south of Wechel. At 0030 hours, September 25th, Sink ordered his battalions to prepare to move out. At 0445, the 506th began marching, in a heavy rain, south from Nuenen toward Wechel. The order of march was 1st Battalion on the right, 3rd Battalion on the left, 2nd Battalion in reserve. At about 0700, the weary men passed through Wechel. At 0830, the 1st and 3rd Battalions began the attack on the salient. Initially, the advance went well, but soon the German artillery and mortar fire thickened. German tanks, brand new Tiger Royals with 88mm guns dug in along the road, added their own machine gun and shell fire. They were supported by Colonel von der Heydt's 6th Parachute Regiment, Easy's old nemesis at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and Carentan. The concentration on the narrow front was murderous. About noon, the battalions were forced to halt and dig in. Sink ordered Lieutenant Colonel Strayer to have 2nd Battalion make an end run, a flanking move to the left. It would be supported by British Sherman tanks. There was a wood of young pine trees along the left-east side of the highway to provide a screen for the flanking movement. Company E led the way for the battalion. Company E's first attack in Holland had been to the south, toward Zon, and then Eindhoven. The second had been to the east, toward Nuenen. The third had been to the north, into Nuenen. Now it would be attacking to the west, thus completing the points of the compass. That was the way surrounded troops fight. That was the way the airborne had been trained to fight. Nixon joined Winters to scout the terrain. They found a pathway on the edge of the woods that was solid and firm, providing traction for the tanks. Good enough so far, but the woods ran out 350 meters from the highway, giving way to open ground that provided no cover whatsoever for the final assault. Winters put the company into formation. Scouts out, 2 columns of men, spread out, no bunching up. They got halfway across the field when the Germans opened up with machine gun fire. Everyone hit the ground. Guarnieri and Malarkey got their 60mm mortar into action. Guarnieri called out range and direction. Malarkey worked the mortar. He was the only man in the field at that point who was not flat on his stomach. His first round knocked out a German machine gun post. Winters was shouting orders. He wanted machine guns to go to work. The crews found a slight depression in the ground and set up the gun. They began to lay down a base of fire. Winters spotted a Tiger Royal dug in hull defilade on the other side of the road and told the machine gunners to take it under fire. Turning to his right, Winters noticed Nixon, examining his helmet, a big smile on his face. A German machine gun bullet from the first burst had gone through the front of his helmet and exited out the side at such an angle that the bullet simply left a burn mark on his forehead. It did not even break the skin. The German fire was too intense. Winters decided to pull the company back to the woods. The process would be to maintain the base of fire from the machine guns while the riflemen backed off the field. When the riflemen reached the woods, they would begin firing to permit the machine gunners to pull back. When Lipton reached Winters on the edge of the woods, Winters told him, "They, the machine gunners, will need more ammo. Get some out there to them." Lipton ran to a Sherman tank. All the tanks were behind the woods, out of sight from the Germans, much to the disgust of the men of Easy. Shermans used .30 caliber machine guns, the same as Easy Company's machine guns. Lipton got 4 boxes of ammunition from the British. He gave 2 to Sergeant Talbot and took 2 himself. They ran out to the machine guns in the middle of the field, which were firing continuously, dropped the boxes, circled around, and ran back to the edge of the field as fast as they could run. The Germans were poor shots, Lipton remembered. We both made it. Just as the German parachute troops began to drop mortars on the machine gun positions, Easy's riflemen went to work, and the machine gunners were able to withdraw. Winters ran back to the tanks. He climbed on the lead tank to talk nose to nose with the commander. He pointed out that there was a Tiger Royal dug in on the far side of the road. If you pull up behind the bank on the edge of the woods, you will be hull defilade and you can get a shot at him. As Winters climbed down, that tank and the one to its left cranked up and began plowing straight through that stand of small pine trees, knocking them down. As the first tank got to the far edge of the woods, it wheeled left to line up for a shot at the Tiger. Wham! The Tiger laid an .88 into it. The shot hit the cannon barrel and glanced off the hull. Evidently, the German commander had fired blind, lining up on the falling tops of the trees. The British commander threw his tank into reverse, but before he could back out, the Tiger put a second round dead center through the turret. It penetrated the armor. The commander's hands were blown off. He tried to pull himself up through the hatch with his arms, but his own ammunition began to explode. The blast killed him and blew his body up and out. The remainder of his crew died inside. The tank burned through the afternoon and into the night, its ammunition exploding at intervals. The Tiger turned its .88 on the second tank and knocked it out with one shot. Easy spent the remainder of the day and all that night in a miserable, constant rain, raking the roadway with mortar fire. Headquarters Company brought up some 81mm mortars to add to the fire. Artillery at Fechel joined in, but cautiously, because elements of the 502nd PIR were attacking the salient from the south. It was a long, miserable, dangerous night for the company, but the Battalion S2, Captain Nixon, had a lovely evening. He found a bottle of schnapps somewhere and drank it himself. He knew he had a perfect excuse, his close call that afternoon when the bullet went through his helmet. He got roaring drunk and spent the night singing and laughing until he passed out. In the early hours of September 26th, the Germans withdrew from the salient. At first light, the 506th advanced on the road, unopposed. Once again, the American paratroopers occupied the ground after a fierce firefight with German paratroopers. That afternoon in the rain, the regiment marched back to Nuenen. Easy Company arrived after dark, dead tired. The following afternoon, the men received their first mail since leaving England 10 days earlier. This strengthened a general feeling that, for the Americans at least, the campaign in Holland was over. That supposition turned out to be wrong, but it was true that the offensive phase of the campaign had ended, and failed. For Easy, as for the 101st, the 82nd, and the British armored and infantry outfits involved in Market Garden, it had been a dispiriting experience. For the British 1st Airborne Division, it had been a disaster. It had landed on the north side of the Lower Rhine on September 17th with 10,005 men. It evacuated on September 26th with only 2,163. Nearly 8,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Not only had there been no strategic or tactical gain to compensate for such losses, now the Allies had a salient leading nowhere that had to be defended. It was a narrow finger pointing into German lines, surrounded on three sides by a superior German force, dependent on the vulnerable Hell's Highway for supplies. 10 days earlier, the euphoria in the Allied camp had been running very high. One more operation and the war would be over, had been the feeling. The Germans had been on the run ever since the breakout in Normandy, from the beginning of August right on through the middle of September. It had been assumed that their unit cohesion was gone, their armor was gone, their ammunition was gone, their morale was gone. Those assumptions proved to be one of the great intelligence failures of the war. In fact, by mid-September, the Germans were well on their way to pulling off what came to be called the miracle of the West. They put their units back together, resupplied and refitted them, brought in replacements, established a coherent defensive line. Eisenhower learned from the experience. In March 1945, he wrote his wife, "I never count my Germans until they're in our cages or are buried." Market Garden was a high-risk operation that failed. It was undertaken at the expense of two other possible offensives that had to be postponed because Eisenhower diverted supplies to Market Garden. The first was the Canadian attack on the approaches to Antwerp, Europe's greatest port and essential to the support of any Allied offensive across the Rhine. In the event, Antwerp was not opened and operating until the end of 1944, which meant that through the fall the Allied Expeditionary Force, AEF, fought with inadequate supplies. The second postponed offensive was that of Patton's Third Army, south of the Ardennes. Patton believed that if he had gotten the supplies that Monty got for Market Garden, he could have crossed the Rhine that fall and then had an unopposed path open to Berlin. That seems doubtful, but we will never know because it was never tried. To the end of his life, Eisenhower insisted that Market Garden was a risk that had to be run. In my interviews with him between 1964 and 1969, we discussed the operation innumerable times. He always came back to this. The first rule in the pursuit of a defeated enemy is to keep after him, stay in contact, press him, exploit every opportunity. The northern approach to Germany was the shortest, over the terrain most suitable to offensive operations, once the Rhine had been crossed. Eisenhower felt that given how close Market Garden came to succeeding, it would have been criminal for him not to have tried. Until I undertook this study of Easy Company, I agreed with his analysis. Now I wonder. Easy Company was as good as any company in the AEF. It had won spectacular victories in Normandy. Its morale was high, its equipment situation good when it dropped into Holland. It had a nice mix of veterans and recruits, old hands and fresh men. Its officers were skilled and determined, as well as being brave. The NCOs were outstanding. Despite this, in the first 10 days in Holland, just as Winters told Strayer the night of the attack at Nuenen, it took a hell of a licking. It failed to get the bridge at Zon. It failed to get through at Nuenen, on its way to Helmond, and for the first time was forced to retreat. It failed in the drive to Uden. It failed in its initial attack on the German salient south of Veghel. The causes of these failures were many. First and most critical, in every case the German opposition outmanned and outgunned the company. The airborne troops did not have the artillery or the manpower necessary to launch a successful attack against German armor. Second, these were crack German troops, including their elite parachute regiment. They did not outfight the men of Easy, but they fought as well as the Americans did. Third, the coordination between the British tankers and the American infantry was poor. Neither Easy Company nor the Guards Armored Division had any training in working with each other. This shortcoming hurt Easy at Nuenen, at Uden, and again south of Veghel. At Brecourt Manor and at Carentan in Normandy, Easy had worked effectively with American tanks. In Holland, it worked ineffectively with British tanks. On a larger scale, the trouble with Market Garden was that it was an offensive on much too narrow a front. The pencil-like thrust over the Rhine was vulnerable to attacks on the flanks. The Germans saw and took advantage of that vulnerability with furious counterattacks all along the length of the line and hitting it from all sides. In retrospect, the idea that a force of several divisions consisting of British, American, and Polish troops could be supplied by one highway could only have been accepted by leaders guilty of overconfidence. Easy was one of 150 or so companies that paid the price for that overconfidence. It jumped into Holland on September 17th with 154 officers and men. 10 days later, it was down to 132.